Mr. Wekesa, good to speak with you. When we look at the downgrade itself, South Africa's 10-year government bond, the question is, will it stay on the BRICS 10-year government bond yield curve, or would it join the Africa curve? That's one of the key questions. So basically, what effect has that downgrade had on South Africa's participation in BRICS?
I think it places South Africa in a precarious situation. Because of all the five BRICS members, South Africa is essentially the weakest on almost all fronts, population-wise, economy-wise, and so forth. So it seems that it will have to go back to the BRICS to try and negotiate mitigating funding so that it can be able to pull out of the current situation. However, the challenge it will definitely face is that it has already been receiving support in terms of loans from the new development bank, of which it hosts the regional African Regional Center for some time now, in fact from 2017, to support efforts towards restructuring ESCOM, for example, among others. But more importantly is the fact that one of the key or the kingpin within the BRICS formation is China. And China itself has been battered quite heavily. As we can see, it's actually trying to restructure to be able to get back into manufacturing, into production, and so it will have very little wiggle room to actually boost other nations, whether through the BRICS formation, through the new development bank, or directly. So I think there are huge challenges for South Africa, and one option that is now increasingly being mentioned is that South Africa will have to consider the option of, in addition to the BRICS, of going to the IMF, which it has avoided for many years, because going to the IMF, International Monetary Fund, comes with strings attached, in the sense that there will be demands for restructuring, for example, of the SOEs, South African state-owned enterprises and so forth. So it looks quite a dicey situation currently for the leadership.
When you talk about the IMF, so many African countries are indebted to the IMF, so many difficulties when it comes to African countries and the IMF, especially when it comes to the demands from the IMF. Where does this put South Africa now when it comes to being the powerhouse economy on the continent?
I think the South Africa's power status is going to be reduced quite substantially. That is if measures are not put in place to kind of ride the wave. As it is, as you rightly put it, African countries that have had to go to the IMF with a begging bowl have had to actually reduce their workforces. South Africa has a huge workforce, labor force, particularly civil service. They have had to undertake very painful austerity measures, in terms of spending and so forth. So South Africa will have then to go through those motions, which might be opposed particularly by, trade unions and civil society, and some sections of civil society, and in fact within the civil service itself. But more importantly, as you rightly say, South Africa has been known as the superpower, if you wish, on the continent. And quite a number of African countries have looked to South Africa for leadership. In fact, South Africa is the only nation on the continent that has a functional foreign aid mechanism under the African Renaissance Development Fund. And therefore, this will shake South Africa, and questions might actually start being raised in terms of, is South Africa really the interlocutor for the continent in the global sphere or not? Given its perhaps weakening economic status. In fact, as it is, South Africa now has the highest number of coronavirus cases on the continent. Yep. So therefore, you might actually start seeing a situation where African countries start slamming brakes on travel from South Africa to their nations, even in terms of goods and so forth. South Africa also in this crisis will have been called upon, or will have been imagined to have actually provided a voice on how the continent responds to it. But it is so very much focused on itself.
Yes.
That cannot do that, yeah.
So finally, we got the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, so much talk about it in the past decade or so. We have that in place at the present moment, and then all of a sudden we're now faced with this pandemic, and it hasn't really struck African countries at the present moment. But when you look at your crystal ball, within 2-3 months, how will this affect Africa as a whole?
I think the scenarios that are playing out is that Africa is not going to avoid an increase in the number, a shooting up in the numbers going forward. It's actually a matter of time from, if you look at the metrics. And therefore, this will have a huge impact if countries start crossing borders on each other, even reducing intra-Africa trade that has already been in place. Already we've seen the continent shaken by the fact that global supply chains were cut, so much so that the resource-rich countries that like Angola, like DRC Congo, like Gabon, Nigeria, South Sudan, for example, which depends on almost 95% of its exports outside, have been badly battered. So what it means, therefore, that if you close internal, continental, intra-Africa borders, which are the main infrastructure for the African Continental Free Trade Area, it will even worsen the economic metrics and the economic development for the continent. So actually, it's a very dicey moment for the African Continental Free Trade Area because of those factors to do with border closures and restrictions.
All right, fantastic talking with you and listening to your insights there. That's our foreign policy expert, Bob Wekesa, talking about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, how that might be affected by the COVID-19 pandemic.